He's been an educator for the last 3.5 decades. He's a climber, he's a writer, he's a grandpa now, and of course he's a local. But this book, Native Air, is a truly wonderful book. And I'm very pleased to welcome John and to have him talk about it. So why don't you all welcome John? Got a couple questions before we start, before you read, because you're going to read about 10 pages or so. But where did this idea come about?
I think it was cooked, someplace I can't identify readily, but I think it was cooking in me a long time ago. I've been asked that a lot, and in 1981, I took some notes, or tried to write something that I think eventually became this. That's one source, but really it started welling up in me in around 2011, 12, 13. And then on a rest day and a climbing trip in 2013, I went into a coffee shop and took a bunch of notes, and they were in, you've read the book, they were in Pete's voice. Pete is the other main character in this friendship. And then that December, a good friend of mine and climbing partner died, and I was just, ripped about it. Bill Beckwith, motorcycle crash.
Wow.
And when I went back to those notes, I had this whole other angle, and the other angle was Joe's voice, which is the narrator, which is what I'll read from shortly. And I think so. What I would say, it was born from an experience of grief that has veins and tendrils that reach back into all kinds of climbing experiences and relationships.
You grew up here, but you were a climber for a number of years. So, would you call yourself a dirtbag?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I continue. I mean, last week I was on the east side climbing. I live out of a Prius. I spend lots of long nights in the tent, in the winter sometimes, not showering for, days, sometimes 2 years ago, 40 some days at a time. So yeah, I'm a dirtbag. I'm low budget too. Yeah, the full deal.
Well, I'm glad. It smells like you showered. So.
I did.
Where do you climb?
Got me on a good day.
Where do you climb, or where your favorite places?
All over the western states, but my favorite places, there are too many to name now, but certainly the Eastern Sierra is key. Eastern Sierra, High Sierra, sort of Whitney to Yosemite, and then in the deserts around there. And then I love Red Rock too, places in Oregon, Wyoming.
So what about your writing, though? Have you always considered yourself a writer?
I've been an on and off the wagon writer for my whole adult life. So when I fall off, I produce something. And in this case, I just fell off hard and stayed on the ground a while.
Wow, how long did it take you, man?
First draft, 3 years.
Okay.
But that was 5 years ago.
How many drafts is that?
Well, the first draft was 3 years, and then I had to find an agent, and then she had to tell me everything that was wrong with it. And so there were lots of revisions through the process of working with an agent, through the process of having publishers vet it, working sometimes with 2 editors, working with a brilliant editor at Green Apple Press, Rose Alexander Leach. She was really instrumental in getting the book into the shape it is in now. So, it's hard to say how long. But the 3 years of working on the first draft were a blast. Everything else has been a fight.
Yeah. But I would imagine working with the editor, it's kind of relationship of a climbing partner, because you have to rely on each other, and there's a lot of back and forth.
And so
Was
much,
the process like that?
very much, so much trust. I mean, you're really out there feeling completely exposed. You have to be able to say what you need and feel and think, and suffer a lot of, different angles of seeing what it is that you feel and think.
Interesting. Well, I confess I haven't read the last 100 pages because I want to hear it in your voice. I want to read it and hear it in your voice. But I would love you if you read to the audience here and you shared some of that.
All right.
Then I'll ask you some questions, and then we'll open it up after.
Okay.
So.
Does anybody want to use this chair that I'm not using? Babby, do you?
That's so kind of you.
Yeah.
I'd love it.
And I like what Rob and Paul are doing, Kate School style. Just put your butt any place it'll fit. if you want to sit down, because this is a 15-minute reading. It's kind of a teaser piece, but I want to say, first of all, thank you for showing up. Sal, whom I knew when I was probably still in diapers. I was 11 years old at the time. Anyway, good to see you all from really different parts of my life. Jeb Lambert, whom I met when he was 13. My family, Sister Barb, sister-in-law Kim, brother Ben, classmates Paul and Rob, classmates from Kate's school, where I first discovered that I might be interested in anything like writing. Some of that with a memorable class that I took with Paul, a creative writing class, where another classmate said, "All you guys ever write about are bugs and stars." And he was probably right. Anyway, I want to thank Michael for arranging this. Michael and this great bookstore building community around books. Please buy books here rather than get them in the mail. I want to note I feel sheepish about celebration these days. We have a climate crisis, a pandemic, heartbreaking and senseless war in Ukraine, and to be feting anything at this time, much less a book, feels a little strained to me. But even as we have, or as I have these calamities in view, I continue to read poetry and fiction, to write, to adventure, to play with my grandchildren, to do and connect with things I love, not just because they're satisfying, but to keep my heart capable of breaking. I think that's what got me into language and literature in the first place. All right, to this book. Native Air is a 3-part novel with an afterword. As I was writing it, I'd finish each part and I'd give it to Courtney, my partner and spouse, and then I would send it to my mother. Partly to share it, partly because they're savvy readers and critics, and partly to test my own jitters and sensibilities. I felt like I was flying a trapeze and they were my net. When I would discuss the novel with my mother, who lives nearby, couldn't be here tonight because she's recovering from a hip surgery, she'd always confuse me for Joe, the narrator. She'd say things like, "Well, when you tell Pete you're leaving," or "that time you got lost on Mariah," and I'd say, "Mom, I'm not Joe." After a while, I gave up with this persnickety, if accurate, correction. So to you, another band of savvy readers, I'll offer this. Joe Howland, the narrator, couldn't make it here this evening, so I'm going to read in his stead. I have a 15-minute segment from an early part of the novel, then I'll take a couple questions, and then you can browse and buy other books in this great store. So, some context. I'm starting on page 9. Joe Howland and Pete Hunter are close friends. They're something like brothers. They're something like a married couple. They meet in college, and during the 80s, they live and travel and climb together for nearly 10 years. This scene is in the late fall of 1988. The climbing season is over. Each is about to start work for the winter. Pete on the ski lifts at Mammoth, Joe making beds at a motel in Bishop. They have a couple weeks of downtime, and Pete disappears, as is his annual habit, in hopes of finding a big remote Sierra wall for a first ascent the following summer, something to keep his appetite keen through the winter. Joe is trying to read up on pertinent subjects in preparation for applying to seminary, but after a couple of days, he starts to worry about Pete. All right, here we go. It's hard to breathe when you read. I was in the town library for much of Pete's 4th day out, working through a small stack of the stuff I figured I'd have to like if I got into a seminary. Buber, Bonhoeffer, Kierkegaard, and Kant. But my eyes kept wandering from the page to a strip of pine trees registering the cold wind outside. I decided I'd go looking early the next day if he didn't return that night. If Pete were hurt and needed a rescue, I could at least save the Forest Service a day of aimless wandering by driving up the dirt roads of the likely entries and finding the motorcycle. That night, I sorted through his materials in the trailer to see if I could narrow my own itinerary by identifying the maps that were missing. But whether he was using one of these or had merely stuffed them into his saddlebag, I couldn't know. The wind whipped up the valley all night, and when the gusts abated, I found myself listening closely for some indication of a motorbike's whine. At dawn, I drove up the Rawson Creek drainage, which became impassable for the Buick after just a few miles. I left the car and ran up the valley's gentle shoulder to the trailhead. Nothing there. This happened twice more. Approach roads too rocky for the big car, so by mid-afternoon I managed just 5 of the 8 canyons I'd hoped to scout. But the exertion of so much running was a helpful check to mounting worry. Last was the creek that tumbles into the valley north of Mount Williamson. We'd put up routes here several years before, and amid the day's driving and running, I'd conceived a likely scenario and grew certain I'd find the bike at the Shepherd Creek trailhead. Williamson was Pete's favorite mountain. Our routes there had gotten quite a lot of attention in climbing circles, but we'd never returned for second ascents. We'd not yet savored these as straightforward, undirtied lines, the sort that climbers enjoy after multiple ascents clean a route of loose flakes, flora, and dangerous debris. First ascents are long, grungy affairs, spicy for all the uncertainty, but tedious too. Even a good line involves a ton of work, at least some danger, and if technically challenging, several attempts in order to link the individual sections. Climbing with beta, Pete said, even if only another climber's hand-drawn topo map, it's like driving the interstate, efficient, predictable, amenity-laden, curve coming, wide shoulder, rest here. We all do it, he said, but it's not the real deal. So having failed to identify a project for the next season, Pete must have gone up to Williamson to solo one of our first great routes. Why not? He'd been talking about it for years. It was a form of concession, too, indulging nostalgia for what we'd done rather than setting the stage for what might lie ahead. The Shepherd Creek Road was washed out, too, though here I had to run only the last 2 miles to the end, and as I jogged along, I felt a surge of joy, both for what I'd figured out and for what Pete's choice indicated. He was making peace with my imminent exodus. The approach to Williamson includes none of the slot canyon shenanigans and fifth-class scrambling that many cliffs require just to get in the vicinity, but the routes themselves are sheer and challenging, one a long, sustained link-up of 5'10" cracks, the other a discontinuous exposed line through the shattered diorite on the right side of the face, whose crux goes at 5'11". Pete would rope solo on this face. If he fell, he'd have some margin of protection, but he would also run out the easier sections to avoid spending a night on the wall, and if he got hurt, he'd have nowhere near enough gear for a self-rescue. By now, he could have been dangling for 2, even 3 days, just inching himself down the cliff, if descending at all. The end of the road broadens into a gravel turnaround and a small parking area. Nothing. But this made sense. The approach trail continues as a gentle swoop up the valley shoulder, a sandy path through sage. Pete would ride the motorcycle up as far as he could and ditch it to the side. So I kept running, taking note of what I could tell search and rescue about where they needed to go. The shadows across the valley disappeared as the light grew low. I was in shorts and shoes, no shirt, and for the first time all day the air felt chilly. I'd been walking through a steep rocky section for half an hour when I realized I had long since passed where Pete could have ridden. Did I miss the bike in the twilight? Had he left it behind a bush or a boulder or even before the end of the road, someplace I'd loped past 2 hours before? I had assumed he was out looking for something to entice me to stick around, but now I wondered if he'd given up on me, climbing alone, not bothering to report to base. I was groping, I knew, trying to rationalize my way to some kind of peace of mind, trying even to be glad. Pete was no longer depending on me, so I was free. I called the Forest Service from a payphone in Independence. I had become certain Pete was on Mount Williamson, but as the dispatch officer talked me through her template of questions, which trailhead was the permit issued for? Where was your friend planning to camp? Fishing or mostly just hiking? I realized I had nothing helpful to say, just that he'd been out for several days, he was alone, and I had many hunches but no evidence as to where they might even begin a search. The dispatcher wandered from her script. Sounds like a tough one, maybe more of a sheriff's department matter. Huh? More like a missing person than a lost hiker. He's not lost, I said, too emphatically. He's in the wilderness, probably climbing, very possibly injured. But we have no idea where he got started or what he was climbing, correct? Some idea. No, many ideas, just nothing certain. A lot of mountain from Whitney to Conness. Isn't that what you said? Between Mount Whitney and Mount Conness? I said I'd be outside the Inyo district office when it opened in the morning, which is where I went next, to fill our water jugs from the spigot outside. Lugging them in pairs, just 20 paces to the car, I felt the full brunt of my fatigue. I'd been out for 16 hours. I'd run more than 20 miles and hiked another 5. I built this certain narrative as to Pete's whereabouts, but found nothing to verify it. My arm seemed to stretch under the weight of the jugs, and with the last of them in hand, I tripped on the hose and dropped it. The plastic ruptured on my foot, the water soaking my shoe. I waited a minute for the rest to gurgle out. I'd known Pete through dozens of close calls, and too many epics and accidents, cold nights on exposed cliffs, mad dashes from and to summits and lightning storms, bloodied fingers and hands, plenty of falling rock. I watched him zipper his gear off an aid pitch on the head wall of El Cap, hurtling 60 feet past popping pins and copperheads before my belay caught him, and then whipping in a wild pendulum across the face at just the level of our stance so that when he flew by me, inches away, I could see the fright in his eyes, though when he swung back, several seconds later, he was cackling and howling, thrilled to be alive. In Zion, in '85, I'd been out on a lead far too long and finally attempting the baffling moves around a short roof when I dislodged a piece of the corner. Pete leaned to avoid the cantaloupe-sized rock, which flew safely to his side, but he took one of the smaller pieces above his ear. I was 60 feet above, still stretched out on insecure holds and now less frightened for what I saw below. Pete slumped to the side, the blood trickling steadily over his neck and back and finally into space in a thin line that broke into droplets as plume from a waterfall. Then for my own tenuous position, his hands had relaxed and fallen away from the rope. He was knocked out. I was no longer on belay. With him unconscious, the 6 feet between my shoes and my last gear may as well have been the full 60, and I was still several moves below a stance from which I might make another good placement. My left foot had been scissoring on small edges for the last little while, but instantly I was steady, frozen with fright. I slotted a brass nut into the shallow flare below my right finger jam, clipped this to the rope, and with breathless, out-of-body alacrity, levered past and above this nut to the bigger holds above. The brass stopper popped out and sailed down the rope as I moved beyond it, but the crack shortly opened to a generous size, and in 2 minutes I built an anchor suitable for a hanging bivouac. From there, I lowered the peak. I've thought about those few minutes many times in the years since. Had I fallen while making the next 3 or 4 moves after he was hit, would the rope have cinched or tangled through Pete's belay device and somehow arrested my flight? Would my last piece have held, placed as it was in this famously friable sandstone, and the piece below that, and then the other, and if not, Pete's belay anchor? In the best but least plausible scenario, I'd have plummeted 40 feet and the sudden jerk and whipping of the rope would have jarred Pete awake and he'd have had the wits to grab it from a lower loop so as not to be burned by the furiously unfurling belay line. More likely, I'm injured, or worse, we're both hurtling down the 700-foot mahogany face, tethered to one another by the umbilical coil of our rope and trailing the clanging detritus of our shattered belay. Descending toward Pete, I could see the full mat of his bloodied head and the dark back of his soaked shirt. I slipped down to his side, took off my shirt to compress the wound. My climbing shoes slipped on the bloodied rock at the side of the belay. With my fussing around him and the ringing of gear, Pete came to, and inside of 2 minutes he was not just fully alert but smiling. He helped me with the cleaning, quick inspection, a gash right in the hard part of the skull above the ear. Back in the saddle, man, he said. Getting late. I must have looked horrified. I'll take my leads as they come, he assured me. I fell 3 times trying to repeat the moves by the roof, top rope or no, which Pete followed smoothly, his head wrapped in a shirt. He led 2 of the next 4 pitches. We topped out in the blazing desert sunset and later saw a brilliant moonrise from the trail back to the car. I tried there, outside the Bishop Ranger Station, to construct a picture of Pete now. Any number of abject positions came to mind. Broken limbed on a narrow ledge, hunkered down for the night in a boulder field to conserve heat, even inching along on his belly, Joe Simpson style. But I couldn't get him dead. not because it was unthinkable, but because I felt sure I'd know it or feel it, some deeper vacancy that would overwhelm the anxious-making, trivializing worries that had me scurrying about. A guy we used to climb with had a girlfriend who fashioned herself a type of mystic. She renamed herself Kiara, pronouncing it Sierra. She was spry and kind of nosy. She'd stare at you with her dark blue eyes and then not say anything. One evening, after a week of camping nearby, she summed us up. "You two are yin and yang. Heat," she said, nodding at Pete, "and cold. Light, dark. Out, in. No wonder you're so joined at the hip." Pete dismissed her as a quack, but I felt she was on to something. Most everybody else assumed us twins, almost identical in height, hair color, foot size, though Pete was the more agile and expressive. So when I began to pull away from Pete, I felt there was some risk to the both of us, a mutual loss of complementarity, and no part of me could compass the prospect that he would engineer it, even by means of calamity. A short while later, I was in the canned beans aisle of Vaughn's when I ran into Melissa, a climber who waitresses at Miguel's. She said Pete had eaten there 2 hours earlier. Dirty, happy, looks like he's been out a while. He didn't say much, just gobbled, ordered another plate of enchiladas he said were for you, and left. "Really?" I said. "Salsa verde, right? I think you're covered." "Thanks, I'm hungry. You look it." I nodded, turning back to the cans I'd been studying, their labels now blurry for the water in my eyes. Nor is Pete's girlfriend at the time, his wife later, Nor had said this of him when we were in college, that no one could infuriate her like Pete, even if she'd rather be infuriated by Pete than befriended by most anyone else. She was trying to let me down softly, as though ours were a kind of common alliance vis-a-vis Pete. No matter. I wasn't Nor, and I wasn't going to drive back to camp and be infuriated. He was okay. I had gotten some air and exercise, more than I wanted, but air and exercise nonetheless. I just needed to heat the beans, Pete would have eaten the enchiladas long before I returned, and get to my tent. The patio fire was ablaze, the tape deck balanced on the trailer steps but either shut off or dead of battery. Pete wore an unzipped parka and stood up from where he'd been hunkered over several layers of topo maps, their corners pinned with empty beer bottles. The parka slipped from his naked shoulder, his wild hair falling away from his face. He switched off his headlamp as I got out of the car. It was nearly still, no engine, the buzz in my head of the past several days entirely evacuated. I didn't feel much, wasn't angry. The wind puffed lightly through the pinions, sending sparks sideways out of the fireplace. "You're back," he said. "I am." "You okay?" he said. "Fine, you?" "Yeah, good. Beat." I couldn't see his lively green eyes, but I felt he was keeping something from me. He nodded toward the fireplace and a foil-wrapped platter nearby. "Miguel's there for you." "Thanks." He flipped his headlamp back on, first at my face, blinding me, and then up and down my torso. Shorts? I was running. The light rested on my feet. "Why the wet shoe?" "Got dark," I said. "Stepped in a stream." "Well," he said, "glad you're okay."
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.
So
Can't wait to read it.
Hi, Lori.
I had to stop reading 100 pages away because I wanted to hear your ending, your voice. You have a wonderful reading voice as well. Is Joe you?
There's a lot of overlap, but no, I'm further along than Joe. One of Joe's problems is the way he freights things with meanings that they can't sustain, which is a very common phenomenon in life, but in climbing too. And that was certainly something I struggled with when I was younger. I don't as much anymore. But yeah, no, there's if there's a Venn diagram, there's a lot of material in the middle. Let's just put it that way.
They're very different, Joe and Pete, yet they work so well together. And if you can describe what each is like and why they work so well together as climbing partners.
Well, it's a great question. Climbing partners and friends. I mean, I got a chance, not had to, write a piece for LitHub recently about this book. It's not a piece about this book. It's about books that contend with a similar theme. And the theme that I wrote about was male friendship, because I feel like what Pete and Joe, it's that complementarity that gnarly word that I summoned there a few minutes ago. It's very deep, and some of it is the fact that they're really different from one another and have distinct needs. Some of it is a very deep appreciation for one another. That is just, I think it's what we call chemistry in relationships, right?
Yeah.
But even after Joe leaves the East Side and leaves Pete, he's his best friend. And one of the hard things this book is, when you get into it, you'll see that it's fundamentally about grief and recovery. And what I wanted to set up was a relationship that was so powerful, so life-changing, and so loving that it would hurt really bad when one of them's not around anymore. So that's
You succeeded very well in doing that. The thing about climbers too, I noticed the clipped language, the dialogue is very short. It's not even complete sentences, yet you completely understand what the other person is saying. And I found you captured that very well. I watched like the dirt bags at Yosemite. If anybody's ever seen these guys hang around, it's like you want to be these guys without the risk, of course. But it's just the relationship that the two established was so deep, yet it lacks a lot of words.
Yeah, I think you're right. And you could say it's because I'm not a good writer of dialogue. That's been suggested. But another angle on it is I would add climbers, lovers, old married couples. Anyone who has achieved a kind of deep intimacy in their relationship is not anyone, many people become more laconic with that in that intimate relationship because it's less necessary. And I think they're in all I think Pete and Joe are all three of those things. They're climbers. They're not homosexual lovers, but they're lovers. They're certainly have love for one another, and they're like a married couple.
They're like Butch and Sundance, Thelma and Louise.
Sure. Yeah.
One thing I noticed, I have to ask you is Mount Moriah. Moriah is referred to in the Bible as where Abraham nearly sacrificed his son Isaac.
Yeah.
And then you had Joe being a seminary student. I mean, was this all by design that it came to you to have this connection? The spirituality of attaining Mount Moriah in addition to Joe's purported spirituality with going to seminary school. Yeah,
it's deliberate. Okay. I think as a metaphor, it's on the lower order. I wouldn't milk it for too much. Okay. Some of it is that Moriah is a place of known for sacrifice, and what they devote, the attention, not so much Pete, but what Joe and Will devote in the second half of the novel to completing the route on Mount Moriah is a massive sacrifice. So I had that in mind, but I also just like the name Moriah too. I like the way it rolls off the tongue. I wanted a fictional space. It doesn't exist. That was important to me.
Yeah.
And there aren't a lot of names left when you look at everything that's in the Sierras. They're mostly taken up. So Moriah wasn't. So I had to secure it.
So there's no place named Moriah.
No.
Okay.
That route. There are many routes and many locations in this book that are based on and sometimes just. You could pretty much take them out of the guidebook for areas like a scene at on one of the 6-shooter desert towers near where you're headed, near the Green River in Utah, is the lightning bolt cracks. It's a scene in this book that people really like because it's very intimate, somewhat homoerotic, little scary, and they're also negotiating Joe's leaving at that point more openly. You remember it from part 1.
Yeah.
And then other routes and other spaces are entirely made up, many of them. And I had a lot of fun with that. And it's kind of what I used to like to do when I was a kid, was like to draw topo maps of made up spaces. So I got to do this with words here.
I'm going to ask you one or two more questions, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. His son Will, Pete's son Will, you had two different voices of mourning. And how were you able to create these two things? Because you got a lot of inspiration from the death of your own friend in the motorcycle accident, but there were two different things. I found that very fascinating, about two different perspectives, and how were you able to write about mourning from different perspectives as opposed to one perspective?
Well, I'm really appreciate that that's how you perceived it, because it's always Joe telling the story, but he is definitely, as you're indicating, trying to give the reader a sense for what it is that Will's going through or might be going through. Sometimes it's speculative, sometimes it's not. Sometimes Will speaks to this, though, in that clipped language you described earlier. I don't, that's a great question. I don't know if I have a good answer, except to say that I really felt it too. And that was helpful. You know, when I was writing those characters, I had the somatic, felt experience of loss. In Joe's case, it's like very place-based, memorable, kind of concrete. In Will's case, it's opaque and it's mysterious and it's troubling, because when his dad dies, he's 4 years old. So his dad is more myth than man to him. And yet his dad has a big presence in his life, partly because Will is a climber, and partly because he is born and bred in the area where Pete really made a name for himself and a reputation.
Wow. What a great story.
Thank
Does
you.
anybody have any questions right now that you want to add?
Paul?
I have a non-deep question.
Good.
I was just reading some of those escapades. I'm wondering how many of those actually happened to you? How many of you worry that had happened to you, or how many did you just make up?
If we sat down together, and there's 30 or 40 in here, I could tell you in great detail, but off the top of my head, I'd say a third. Yeah. I mean, the one that I just described, that's never happened to me. I didn't kick something off and knock out my belayer in Zion. That's totally made up. But the lightning bolt cracks thing is very much based on an ascent I did with Jason Wells in 15 years ago. So
You dropped on top of me your junior year.
I remember
You
that.
didn't know that.
It didn't make the book. It was too shitty around and too embarrassing an accident. It's true. 1978, Joshua Tree, broke my ankle or foot, chipped a heel. Yeah.
You have a climbing partner?
I've many, but two or three really good, solid, regular. Two really. Guy Chris McElhaney, 68 years old, but you wouldn't know it, from Bend, Oregon. And then my longest and most faithful and best climbing partner, Dave Goldstein from Boulder, Colorado, who's my age, went to college with him, met him in college, was in Yosemite with him in '81, was in Bishop with him last week. So yeah, but I climb with a lot of different people. You have to be kind of a, pardon the term, but a whore as a climber. You just got to go with who's available, because it's time consuming and very committing, and often climbing relationships aren't, they don't work out because there's not the level of trust, and then there's a lot of downtime too. There's the getting to the cliff and the long nights and all that. So yeah, it's a special type of context for a friendship and a relationship. I spent a lot of time with this guy Chris McElhaney in the last 2 years since I quit my job, and that's been great.
Before I read the book, I need to know what a belayer is. I'm sorry.
There's a glossary, Kim. Yeah, there is. I mean, one of the things that was hard about this was I wanted, it's very pretentious sounding, people, but I didn't think I was going to finish it. I didn't think I was going to finish the book, and I didn't think if I did, I'd ever be able to sell it or get anybody else to read it besides my mother and Courtney. So I thought to myself, what the hell? What did Melville do with Moby Dick, right? how many whalers have read Moby Dick? Most of them were illiterate. And that was the permission I took. So there's a lot of saturation of vernacular and culture in here, and very little explanation. And some of that's, part of my feeling is you don't need to know what was it? Copperheads and what? Paul? Popping pins and copperheads. You don't need to know what that is to know that it's chaotic and dangerous sounding, right? That's kind of where I go. Or that furiously unfurling belay line sounds like something that's coming apart to my ear. So that was the permission I took. It's not going to work for everybody, that's for sure. My agent always said, "This is work. This is work."
Well, speaking of somebody who read it, William Finnegan, who wrote Barbarian Days, he's a Pulitzer Prize winning author, had a copy of your book. If
Before
you
it was
could share
a book.
that. Yeah, when it was just a manuscript.
Yeah.
So what happened with that?
He got it through a surfer I know who's a climber. And it sat in his shed in Connecticut for a year, and then COVID happened, and he decided to clean out the shed because that's what people did. And he started reading it, and he just really loved it. And he called me, and I got this really sweet blurb from Bill Finnegan, and this other one from Dan Duane, a great California writer. I think it's been helpful, but it certainly didn't kick the doors down. It's amazing. We thought it would. The agent said, "This is a good day." But, that's 5 years ago. Anyway, it was really fun to talk to Bill. He really loved the book, and his command of detail in it was shocking. I mean, he knew more stuff than I did. I hadn't read it in months, and it was really fun.
Wow.
Babby.
Were there books that you've read over the past decade since you've been climbing that inspired you or taught you or encouraged you to keep going, or that led you to writing this book of your own?
Thanks for asking that. Probably not so. I mean, I'm a crazy reader. I read all the time. But the things that inspired me, I read before the last decade. I would really lean on Faulkner, on The Bear, and Absalom, The Sound and the Fury, and Melville, and this book you'll see it loops back time and again. It's always going back as well as going forward, and that's a Toni Morrison thing. So those writers, they're the ones I reference. I know it sounds ridiculous, but for sure. I don't read adventure fiction. I've never read Into Thin Air. I'm not interested in climbing literature generally. I only read Solo Faces by James Salter, which is another climbing novel, 3 months ago, and that was very deliberate. I didn't want to read it. While I was working on this, I wanted, when this went to the printer, I picked up James Salter's book. So, but yeah, I mean, those, Louise Erdrich is a huge influence.
Wow.
Rob.
Just regarding climbing as an activity, as a lifestyle, your grandfather, I don't know if any of your kids climb, but just that balance between, for people who don't climb, it seems so dangerous and so crazy, and there are obviously accidents, and you've got a person who dies in the book, and yet there's many lifelong climbers that are thoughtful and cautious, and a bit of luck mixed in, obviously, with all that. How do you, as a climber, balance the risk versus reward? And as a parent, should any of your kids have climbed, how did you balance your own concerns for their safety as a parent?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking that. One thing about the book, the death in the book is he dies climbing solo. So, like Alex Honnold, but he falls. And that's something climbers do, many climbers. I do it at a level where if I fell, I would die, but I won't fall because the stuff is very, accessible. It's not extreme. That just goes with technical climbing for most people. But I don't want to belabor the point except to say that I've had to think about this more in writing the book and in also in kind of like representing the book. Someone recently asked me, a woman, why not just hike? Yeah, a friend of mine. And it, I said, because death. You know, the fact that your body knows when you get 20, 30, 40, 50 feet off the deck, much less 2,000 feet off the deck. Even if you're very comfortable in those contexts, which many climbers become, if not most, your body knows that it's right there, right? And that's, sadly, that's inextricable from the activity, that proximity to the, whatever it is, death, the void. And so that's what I would say. My kids, one of them, daughter climbs, son doesn't, glad he doesn't. He's summited some peaks with me, but hasn't done technical things. Emily's not like super into it. Most of the climbing she does with me, so it's very safe for her. As far as my own feelings about it, you know, not climbing is safer than climbing, but there's nothing like climbing. And so that's just, you know, and I'd rather die climbing than live a long time, frankly. I mean, that's where I am. And I can say that now that I'm 60 and the kids are out of the nest and taken care of. That was, I didn't climb for 18 years when my kids were small, and I think that was part of it. That was a level of fright and exposure just was hard to get over, maybe.
Yeah.
Also, climbing's got, you know, technical rock climbing is not alpinism. It's not, there are no glaciers, right? There's no white water. There's driving to the cliff is probably statistically more dangerous. And most of the accidents are mental error. You know, there are some things you can't control, rock fall and sometimes a gear problem, but yeah, it's pretty rare. I mean, my good friend Jason died climbing, you know, 4 years ago, this June. Really good climbers die, but it's very unusual.
How much longer do you climb?
Sorry?
When do you quit?
When? Well, I don't know. You know, that's one reason I quit was
You're 60 years old now, right?
I'm 61, and one reason I quit my job is I was saying, you know, retirement's wasted on the elderly, and I wanted to use up the juice while I had it. So that's my intention. My partner Chris from Bend is 67, 68, and he's strong. He's a better climber than I am. But I don't think I'll last that long. I can see it out. I mean, part of the deal is it's like basketball or tennis or something like that. When you get used to a level of competence and performance, and then you can't attain it, it's really freaking frustrating. Right? And I'm right there at that point, I think, where it's diminishing returns. But I'm pretty psyched right now. So you know, it's not a bad deal when you're not climbing, you're riding and playing with your grandchildren. So I could do more of the latter.
Does writing this book make you want to write another book?
I'm working on another.
Already?
2 others, actually. One
Alright.
is with an editor, a collection of stories. Mike asked about writing, and I did write 20 pieces of short fiction, and 8 of them are in a manuscript that an editor has right now that I'm working on. And then I'm working on another novel that's nothing like this one, set in our hometown. Multi-generational family story, San Francisco.
Well, we can't wait.
All right, cool.
But in the
Thanks so much
meantime,
for
let's sign some books and
Thanks for
thank you.
Thanks, everybody.